A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Eyes of Ancient Power. The tavern smelled of aged ale and wood smoke. The kind of establishment where whispers carried the weight of secrets and reputations died quietly in the shadows. Mira Blackthorne moved between the scattered tables with the practiced grace of someone who had learned, long ago, that invisibility could be a shield as much as a weapon. She was 24, with dark hair braided away from her face, and fingers stained perpetually with the residue of herbs her mother had taught her to cultivate in secret. The texts sat hidden beneath her mattress, worn leather covers holding knowledge that predated even her grandmother's time. Rituals of binding and unbinding, of transference and protection, all written in the careful hand of women who understood that some magic belonged to the living world, not to the supernatural realms that brushed against it like curious predators. Nobody in the village knew the full truth of what she studied. They saw only the hospitable young woman who served drinks and listened to the locals complain about their troubles, nodding sympathetically as men spoke of failed harvests and women lamented childlessness. Mira had perfected the art of being unremarkable, of slipping through conversations like water through cracks. It was necessary. Her mother had been less careful, and Mira had watched her die for that carelessness, had watched the way the shifters who came through their mountain pass looked at her mother with barely concealed hunger, recognizing something in her that marked her as someone who understood the old ways. Iris Caldwell was different. Mira had known this from the moment they first met, though it had taken months of careful observation to understand precisely how. The healer who rented the cottage at the edge of the village worked exclusively with human patients, turned away any shifter who arrived at her door seeking treatment. Iris kept her eyes covered with strips of dark cloth, claiming sensitivity to light, keeping her gaze downcast during transactions at the market. But sometimes, on the rare occasions when their eyes met directly, Mira saw something flicker behind those cloth barriers, a golden light, swift and violent, like captured lightning. And she recognized it, because her mother had described something similar once, late at night, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. There are those among the shifters whose power is in their gaze, her mother had said, running her fingers through Mira's hair. They are rare, and they are feared. The ancients called them sirens, back when the world was still young enough to have proper magic. Their eyes can break the strongest will. A glance can topple kingdoms. Mira had been 14, too young to fully comprehend the weight of that knowledge, but old enough to understand that some information could be a death sentence if spoken aloud. Now, 10 years later, Mira found herself drawn to the stranger with covered eyes. She brought her herbs and carefully written notes, claiming ailments that required treatment. She asked questions carefully, learned that Iris had arrived in the village approximately 8 years ago, that she had no family, that she lived in deliberate isolation from the shifter communities that occasionally passed through their mountain territories. And slowly, piece by piece, Mira assembled a picture of someone who was not merely different, but fundamentally hunted, someone hiding from her own nature. The storm had been building for days, an unnatural tension in the air that made the animals nervous, and the older residents speak of omens. Mira noticed it in the way the birds flew in fragmented patterns, the way the wind carried something ancient and wrong. She had read about such storms in her mother's texts, weather that wasn't weather at all, but magic made manifest, invoked by those who sought to flush something hidden from its sanctuary. She was carrying a bundle of carefully prepared herbs to Iris's cottage when she heard the commotion. The healer was attending to a pregnant woman, one of the few times Mira had ever seen her within the human community, attending to actual medical emergencies. The cottages were small and close together in this quarter of the village, and sounds carried. The man appeared suddenly, materializing out of the afternoon mist with the kind of unnatural speed that made Mira's breath catch. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a leather coat, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a predator. When he shifted, and she saw it happen, saw the moment his human form flickered like a candle flame. His wolf was massive, silver-gray fur catching what little light remained, and he bore the marks of a warrior. A beta, at minimum. Someone who had spent his life ascending through ranks, fighting for position within whatever pack had claimed him. He had caught Iris's scent. Mira recognized the moment it happened, by the way his entire body went rigid, by the way his nostrils flared and his head tilted in that peculiar angle that shifters adopted when something extraordinary registered in their world. A ripple moved through him, like recognition, like hunger, like the moment before a predator decides to strike. The cottage door was still open. Iris was still inside, attending to the laboring woman. Mira moved without conscious thought, stepping into the man's line of sight, her arms spreading slightly, making herself present in the only way a human could, with her body, with her will, with the absolute conviction that she would not move. It was foolish. It was perhaps the most foolish thing she had ever done. But watching Iris's life unravel before her eyes was not something Mira could permit. The beta looked at her, and she saw the moment he decided she was insignificant. His attention swung back to the cottage, and he began moving toward it with that same predatory grace. That was when Iris screamed. It wasn't the sound of a human woman in distress. It was something older, something that seemed to tear through the fabric of reality itself, a sound that belonged to storms and to the breaking of ancient things. The beta froze mid-stride, his entire body going rigid. And through the cottage window, Mira saw them. Golden eyes, burning with a light so intense that it seemed impossible they could exist within a human skull. The cloths that had bound Iris's vision lay shredded on the floor. The beta's form collapsed into something between human and wolf, twisted and wrong, and he fell to his knees with a sound like a man choking. His eyes remained fixed on Iris, and even from outside, even through the window, Mira could see the moment his will simply ceased to exist. He became a vessel for something else's intention, a puppet with its strings cut, and he knelt there as if gravity itself had increased 1,000-fold. Iris, visible only in fragmented glimpses through the doorway, was making a sound that might have been terror, or might have been something else entirely. And then she collapsed, her body crumpling like something severed at the spine. The beta remained kneeling, silent and still, his eyes never leaving the place where Iris had fallen. Mira heard the woman inside the cottage cry out, heard the sound of movement, and realized that birth did not wait for drama to resolve itself. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, life asserted itself, indifferent to the supernatural events unfolding in the adjacent room. A baby's first cry, thin and vulnerable and entirely human, cut through the storm-laden afternoon air. The beta remained on his knees, no longer conscious of anything except the woman who had taken his will and cast it aside like a discarded thing. And across the shifting landscape of the kingdom's borderlands, in the great fortress of Iron Peak, where stone and magic had been forged into something transcendent, a man with black hair falling to his shoulders sat upright in his war room, amber eyes snapping open. His generals paused in their discussions. The maps spread before him seemed suddenly inadequate, marked as they were with the old knowledge, the established territories, and the predictable patterns of shifter civilization. Kale Stormborn rose to his feet, and the movement itself seemed to alter the atmosphere, the way a predator's rising changes the temperature of a room. His tunic was leather and silver, and the coronal of gold upon his brow caught the light of candles arranged in careful patterns across the table. He was 34 years old, and he had ruled the interconnected kingdoms of shifters for the past 8 years, ever since his father had relinquished power to him. But in all that time, no messenger had brought him news that made his wolf stir beneath his skin quite like this. "Send word," he commanded, and his generals straightened, decades of military discipline snapping into place at the tone of his voice. "I want reports from every settlement within 50 leagues. Something has awakened, something old, and I will know what it is before nightfall." His beta, Jackson Ravensfield, stepped forward from where he had been observing the territorial discussions. He was younger than Kale by 5 years, built lean and sharp like a blade, with eyes that held ambition wrapped in careful subordination. "The storm that's been moving through the mountains?" "No," Kale said, his hand moving to the pommel of his sword, a gesture that meant nothing and everything. "That is merely the announcement. Something else is the substance beneath, something that carries the weight of ancient magic." In the village at the mountain's edge, Mira knelt beside the unconscious healer and made a decision that would reshape the trajectory of her life. She reached beneath her dress, feeling for the small pouch that contained her most carefully guarded possession. Not the texts, not the herbs, but something far more valuable. An amulet of her mother's, inscribed with sigils meant for protection and concealment. She pressed it into Iris's hand and began, with whispered words drawn from memory and desperation, to invoke protections that she had never dared speak aloud before. The beta remained on his knees, waiting. But in the great fortress, Cale was already moving toward his stables, already calling for his fastest mount, already sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the carefully balanced world of shifter politics. The game, as it were, was beginning to move. And he intended to understand its rules before anyone else could learn them well enough to use them against him. Chapter 2. The Hunted Become Captive. The journey toward consciousness felt like swimming upward through water made of stone. Iris became aware first of sensation, the rough texture of rope around her wrists, the sway of motion that suggested she was being carried, the sound of hooves against earth that belonged to no ordinary horse. Her eyelids were weighted, impossible to lift, and for a long moment she could not remember why waking felt like surfacing from drowning. Then, it came back. The beta's face, her own scream, the golden light that had erupted from her eyes with all the force of something breaking through chains that had held it imprisoned for far too long. She forced her eyes open despite the heaviness that seemed embedded in her very bones. Above her, the sky was wrong. Too dark for afternoon, though the sun should have been nowhere near setting. And as her vision cleared, Iris realized that the sky wasn't the sky at all, but stone, carved and shaped into an arch, so perfectly executed that it seemed to exist in defiance of natural law. The air around her shimmered with something that made her skin prickle, a sensation not quite painful but deeply uncomfortable, as though she was moving through multiple layers of reality at once. She was in a carriage of sorts, though the craftsmanship was unlike anything produced in her village. The seats were leather that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the wheels beneath her made no sound despite the uneven terrain they traversed. Through the small window, she caught glimpses of landscape that belonged to the mountains she knew, and also to somewhere else entirely. The trees were the same pines and firs, but they seemed older here, more aware. The stones that jutted from the earth carried inscriptions in languages her eyes couldn't quite focus upon, symbols that seemed to writhe when she tried to read them directly. Across from her sat a man whose eyes held the flat clarity of someone conducting business. He was middle-aged, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and he watched her with the kind of attention that suggested she was merchandise being assessed for damage during transport. "The healer is awake," he said, his voice carrying to whoever was driving the carriage. His accent was unfamiliar, layered with something that didn't belong to any human kingdom she had ever heard discussed. "Ensure that she remains secure. The payment we've been promised depends upon her arriving in intact condition." Only much later would Iris learn that the so-called client was Iron Peak itself, a retrieval detail operating under the Alpha King's standing orders to secure anomalies before rival factions could. What she had read as mercenary detachment was, in truth, drilled discipline. The ropes around her wrists had been tied by someone who understood the nature of shifter strength. They weren't simple hemp, but something that radiated a dull ache, as though the material itself was actively dampening her ability to shift, to call upon the wolf that lived beneath her human skin. Iris tried to move her arms, and found the pain intense enough to make her gasp. "Struggling will only worsen things," the man said with the tone of someone reciting advice he had given many times before. "The restraints are charmed to suppress transformations. Break them, and the suppression will rebound through your entire system. I've seen shifters go mad from the backlash. Not ideal circumstances, I assure you, but the client was quite specific about the condition in which you were to be delivered." Iris forced her voice to work, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "Who sent you?" The man smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "An organization with interests in rare specimens. Your particular talents have attracted considerable attention in circles far beyond your mountain village. Apparently, there are those who remember the old ways, who understand what a woman whose eyes carry the weight of ancient magic might be capable of achieving." The carriage began to slow, and through the window, Iris caught her first glimpse of the castle that would become her prison. It rose from the mountainside as though the stone itself had been convinced to remember its purpose. Towers spiraling upward in defiance of reasonable architecture. The air around it shimmered more intensely. And Iris understood that they were transitioning between realms. That what she was seeing existed in a space that the human village could never perceive. They descended for what felt like hours, but could have been mere minutes. Time behaved strangely here, stretching and contracting in ways that made her head ache. When the carriage finally came to rest, she was in an underground chamber lit by stones that glowed with their own bioluminescence, casting everything in shades of green and silver that belonged to fever dreams. She was carried, not roughly, but with a kind of careful efficiency that suggested her captors had done this many times before, through corridors that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The walls here were covered in inscriptions, thousands upon thousands of symbols layered over one another, and she sensed that she was looking at accumulated centuries of magical notation, preservation spells and containment protocols, and things she had no framework to understand. Her room was luxurious in a way that felt designed to mock her. The bed was too fine, the furniture carved from wood that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. Water ran from taps in the walls, actual running water in this underground fortress, and someone had arranged food upon a table near the bed. All of it was an insult dressed in courtesy. That was when she realized that the door sealed behind her with a sound like reality itself snapping into place. She tried the handle, and her hands passed through it without resistance, suggesting that the lock was magical rather than physical. She tried her power next, reaching for the golden light that lived behind her eyes, calling upon it the way one might call upon a pet, and felt it respond eagerly, desperately, as though it had been waiting for permission to emerge. The room exploded with light. It poured from her eyes, her mouth, seeming to emanate from her very skin, and she heard herself making a sound that was not quite human. The luxury of the prison became less relevant when the glass in the windows cracked, when the delicate furniture splintered, when the magic that had been so carefully calibrated to contain her found itself overwhelmed. And then it was over. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, realizing that the light had released itself, and then immediately, desperately, retreated back inside her. Her hands were shaking. Blood ran from her nose, dripping onto the fine stone floors. That was when the guard tried to enter. She heard the sound of the lock unsealing, heard the door swing inward, and felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of what she was capable of doing. The shifter, a large man, probably a beta, probably trained in restraint and control, stepped through the doorway and his eyes met hers. Not deliberately, not with any particular intention on her part, just an accident of positioning, a moment of proximity that should have meant nothing. His body locked up as though someone had poured concrete through his veins. He fell to his knees, his eyes rolling back, and Iris realized with horror that she had taken his will from him. Not stolen it, exactly, but overwhelmed it, subsumed it beneath her own, or perhaps beneath something that lived in her eyes and predated her own existence. She looked away immediately, and he collapsed completely, unconscious, or worse. Over the next 2 days, she learned the parameters of her power through catastrophic application. Any shifter who entered her room fell into the same state. Any shifter whose eyes met hers became her unwilling subject, their will simply ceasing to operate as distinct from her own. She tried closing her eyes, wrapping cloth around her face, even attempting to cloud her vision with tears in hopes of distorting whatever it was that gave her gaze its weight. None of it worked. The power had been awakened, and awakening had made it ravenous. By the 3rd day, her captors had stopped trying to attend to her directly. Food was left outside the door, and no one retrieved the plates. The fortress had essentially become a prison for the prisoner, with the guards as afraid of her as she was afraid of what she had become. That was when the air in the castle changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the quality of the magic that permeated the stone, as though something vastly older and more powerful had begun moving through the corridors. The shifters in the fortress, she could sense them now, their presence like pressure against her consciousness, began moving with urgency that suggested something significant was happening. The door to her chamber unsealed, and she braced herself, certain that whatever came next would be worse than what had already transpired. The man who entered was nothing like the guards she had encountered. He was tall, with dark hair falling to his shoulders, and he wore a mantle of wolf pelts across his broad frame, silver fur that seemed to catch light even in the dim luminescence of the magical stones. A crown of gold rested upon his brow, crafted in a style that spoke of centuries of craftsmanship, and when his eyes met hers, Iris felt something inside her recognize something inside him. She tried. Gods. She tried. She reached for the golden light, called upon her power with all the desperation of a drowning woman, and felt it surge forward like a thing with intention. Nothing happened. His eyes remained steady on hers, gray eyes with hints of something deeper, something that carried the weight of mountains and storm systems, and all the fury that ancient things could gather when they chose to move. He was utterly unaffected by the power that had broken every other shifter she had encountered. "I am Cale Stormborn," he said, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to reshape the air itself. "Alpha King of these lands, and you, I believe, are the reason an entire garrison of my soldiers has been rendered unconscious." Iris found that she was shaking. The golden light receded from her eyes, retreated into whatever chamber in her soul it occupied, when she was not actively destroying someone's will. And looking at this man, this being who seemed to exist in a different category of existence entirely, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt afraid, but more than that, she felt something that might have been relief, though she could not quite name the reason why. Chapter 3. Castles and Conspiracies. The fortress of Iron Peak was nothing like anything Iris had imagined when she heard ancient stories whispered in her village. Stone and magic had been woven together in ways that suggested millennia of refinement, and the architecture itself seemed to breathe with intention. Corridors that appeared to lead nowhere opened onto vast chambers. Walls that seemed solid sometimes revealed hidden passages, and the light that illuminated the corridors came not from torches or candles, but from stones embedded deep within the mortar itself, stones that pulsed with a rhythm that reminded her disturbingly of heartbeats. Cale had not imprisoned her in a dungeon. That, at least, was something. Instead, she had been placed in a chamber that occupied an entire tower, with views of landscape that belonged simultaneously to the world she knew, and to realms she had no framework to understand. The furniture was fine without being ornate, the bed comfortable, the water that ran from the taps both hot and cold depending on which one she turned. There were books stacked on shelves, thousands of them, their spines bearing titles in languages she couldn't read. Someone had clearly gone to considerable effort to make her confinement comfortable. The irony was not lost on her. Lady Morvana arrived on the second day, and her entrance seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the fortress. She was a tall woman, with silver streaking through her dark hair, and eyes that held the particular shade of gray that suggested she carried shifter blood in her veins, though she was not, Iris sensed, a shifter herself anymore. Something had changed in her. Some fundamental aspect of her nature had been altered, and whatever it was had left scars that no amount of magic could fully repair. She did not knock. She simply appeared in Iris's chamber, as though the sealed door meant nothing, and her expression was one of absolute contempt. "You should be executed," Morvana said without preamble. Her voice carried an accent that suggested centuries of refinement, a way of speaking that implied she had been important for a very long time. "Your very existence is a violation of the accords that have maintained peace in these lands for generations. My son apparently forgets that some things are more important than indulging his curiosity." Iris stood, instinctively moving away from the older woman. "I haven't done anything to warrant—" "You exist," Morvana interrupted, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was not a debate, but a simple statement of fact. "Your bloodline is a blight upon the hierarchy that has kept our kind from destroying itself. Your power is an abomination that should have been excised from the world when your grandmother was still drawing breath." The words struck something deep in Iris's chest, some part of her that had always believed, at least partially, that the older woman was correct. She opened her mouth to respond, but Morvana had already turned toward the door. "I will speak to Cale," the woman said, her hand resting on the frame. "We will establish proper protocols for your containment, and if he proves foolish enough to resist, I will ensure that the Council of Alphas learns of his weakness. Your presence here will become a political liability that even the Alpha King cannot ignore." She left before Iris could respond, and the door sealed behind her with that same sound of reality snapping into place. That afternoon, Cale came to her chamber. He brought documents with him, ancient parchments that smelled of time and preservation spells, their edges reinforced with thread that seemed woven from light itself. He spread them across a table and gestured for her to join him. "These are records of your bloodline," he said without preamble. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had proven so terrifyingly immune to her power, studied her face as though trying to read something written in her features, dating back to before the Accords were established. Before the hierarchy was formalized, Iris approached cautiously, half expecting some kind of trap. But Cale simply moved aside, creating space for her to examine the documents without obstruction. The handwriting on them was elaborate, formal, written in a style that suggested centuries-old importance. But as she read, and her reading was halting, the language shifting between Old English and something older still, she began to understand what Cale was showing her. The power in her eyes was not a curse. It was a remnant, a fragment of magic so ancient that it predated the entire structure of shifter society, the hierarchy and the classifications that had seemed so immutable to her. "Before there were alphas and betas and omegas," Cale explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting history he had learned long ago. "There were shifters whose power was singular, not measured against others, not ranked within a hierarchy, but simply present, overwhelming, absolute. Your ancestor was one of them, the Siren Queen, as she came to be known. The beta tried to capture me because of her," Iris whispered. It was not quite a question. "The beta tried to capture you because he sensed something in you that his instincts recognized as dominant," Cale corrected. "Because the magic in your eyes speaks to something deeper than the constructed hierarchy. It speaks to the old laws, the ones that existed before anyone decided that power could be classified and ranked and made sense of." He gathered the documents back into a careful stack, his movements precise. "Your mother hid you away because she understood what you were. Your father supported that decision because he loved her. And the man who raised you, Abbot Greystone, did so because he wanted to control what he had found." Iris looked up at him sharply. "How did you—" "I have sources," Cale said simply. "People who watch the movements of those who traffic in forbidden things. Abbot Greystone is a member of an organization called the Archives. They collect what they believe to be dangerous magical artifacts and individuals. They've been very patient in their acquisition of you. Very methodical." "Then why didn't you just give me to them?" Iris asked. And she was surprised to find that she was angry. Angry at Abbot, angry at her parents for hiding her, angry at circumstances that had conspired to make her into something hunted and feared. "Because I have no interest in giving you to anyone," Cale said. And something in his expression shifted, softened in a way that was almost dangerous in its own right. "And because I suspect that Abbot Greystone is not entirely what he appears to be." The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Iris was given the freedom to move through the castle, with the clear understanding that she could not leave it. Cale began spending time with her, bringing her texts to read, explaining the political structures that governed the various shifter kingdoms, discussing the history of her bloodline in clinical detail, as though her power was simply another element of study rather than something that made her fundamentally other. They did not touch. They barely spoke of anything personal, and yet something in her began to shift, some fundamental aspect of her perception of what was happening. On the 7th day, Abbot Greystone appeared at the gates of Iron Peak. He came with documentation, with official seals from organizations whose authority even Cale seemed to acknowledge, and he demanded an audience in the great hall of the fortress. Iris watched from a balcony overlooking the hall as Abbot presented his case to Cale and his inner council, as he spoke of her guardianship and his legal right to her custody. Cale listened with an expression that suggested polite interest. And then he produced documents of his own. The records were extensive. They showed gaps in Abbott's guardianship, years where he had registered no official transactions on her behalf, no maintenance of her properties, no legal filings related to her welfare. They showed rituals registered in his name at locations across the realm, rituals that no legitimate guardian would ever perform. They showed financial transactions that traced directly to organizations known to traffic in dangerous magic. And they showed that most of Abbott's official documentation was counterfeit. Beautifully done, expertly forged, but counterfeit nonetheless. "You have two choices," Cale said, his voice steady and absolutely devoid of mercy. "Leave my territory immediately, or be detained for investigation into trafficking forbidden materials. Choose now." Abbott's face cycled through several expressions: rage, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like resignation. He left without another word, but not before his eyes met Iris's across the great hall, and she saw in them a promise of future conflict. Jackson Ravensfield, Cale's beta, was less accepting of the situation. Iris became increasingly aware of his presence in the castle, the way his eyes tracked her movements, the barely concealed tension that accompanied any moment when she and Cale were in proximity. On the 10th day, he found her in the library and spoke to her with a bluntness that was almost refreshing in its honesty. "He'll destroy you," Jackson said without preamble, "or you'll destroy him. Either way, this ends badly. The Alpha King does not bond with creatures like you without consequences." "I'm not bonding with anyone," Iris replied, though even as she said it, she felt the lie in her words. "No?" Jackson smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Then why does he spend every evening with you? Why does he bring you history and context and act as though your existence is not a political catastrophe waiting to happen?" He stepped closer, and she felt the weight of his presence, the pressure of his nature as a shifter who had spent his entire life ascending through hierarchy and competition. "Leave," he said quietly. "I can arrange it. I can help you escape this place, help you disappear into the world where they can't find you. It would be better for everyone. For you, for him, for the stability of these lands." "I can't shift," Iris said. "The moment I'm outside these walls, I'll be hunted, and I'll be alone doing it." "Then bond with someone else," Jackson suggested. "Someone whose power would better complement yours, someone who could help you survive." She understood what he was offering then, and she understood, too, that it came from a place of genuine concern mixed with something else. Ambition, perhaps, or competition, or the simple desire to remove from the picture someone who was complicating his own ascent through power. She refused him gently, and he left, but she could feel the tension that his departure left behind. The sense that something in the fortress had shifted slightly out of alignment. By the 14th day, Iris had read through most of the texts Cale had left for her. She understood the history of her power better now, understood that she was not an aberration, but a remnant, a fragment of an older world that had not quite managed to be fully suppressed by the new hierarchy. She understood that her mother had loved her, but had also feared her, and that her father had made the choice to support that fear, even at the cost of his own life. She understood, too, that Cale was not imprisoning her out of cruelty, and was not keeping her around out of mere curiosity, but she did not understand what he intended, or what would happen when the political realities of her situation forced him to make a choice between protecting her and protecting his throne. The fortress had begun to feel less like a prison, and more like a waiting room, and Iris was beginning to suspect that whatever came next would determine whether she had been saved or simply transferred to a more gilded cage. Chapter 4. The Breaking of Walls. The ancestral ritual chamber existed in a state of half-reality, carved deep within the mountain at a time when the boundary between worlds was far more porous than it had become in subsequent centuries. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with accumulated magic, their surfaces etched with symbols that predated any written language Iris had encountered. When Kyle led her through the entrance on the first day of her training, she felt the pressure of centuries bearing down upon her, the weight of every ritual that had been performed within these stone walls, every invocation, every binding. "This is where I was trained," Cale said, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to shift slightly as it traveled through the chamber, as though the space itself was refracting his words into something larger than intended. "Where my father taught me the boundaries of power, and more importantly, where he taught me how to move through the world without becoming consumed by it." Iris stepped forward carefully, her hands brushing against the nearest wall. The stone was warm, almost alive beneath her fingertips, and she felt a sensation akin to recognition, as though the chamber was acknowledging her presence, cataloging her arrival into its accumulated memory. "Your power," Cale continued, positioning himself at the far end of the chamber, where a series of objects had been arranged. Stones of varying sizes, crystals that caught and bent light in impossible angles, smaller items whose purpose she could not immediately identify, has been approaching consciousness in fragmented bursts. You've been allowing it to activate as reaction, rather than choice. That ends now. The training began simply. Cale would gesture to an object, and Iris would attempt to extend her power toward it without actually looking at it. The stones came first. Large, inert things that responded to her efforts by glowing slightly. The golden light she emitted seeming to resonate with whatever magical properties the stones possessed. She learned to modulate the intensity of her gaze, to direct the power with precision, rather than unleashing it in explosive waves. Days became a blur of concentration and subtle victories. A stone would glow brighter at her command. A crystal would hum with resonance. The larger architectural stones that formed the chamber's foundations would pulse in time with her heartbeat when she focused deeply enough. Kyle moved through each exercise with the patience of someone who had spent centuries teaching others, offering corrections without judgment, adjusting her approach based on minute shifts in her technique. By the second week, she was beginning to understand the architecture of her power. It was not a force that originated in her eyes, but rather something that traveled through her entire body and simply emerged through her gaze as a point of focus. It was not truly dominance, but rather an expression of will so concentrated that other beings' consciousness simply could not resist it. The distinction seemed subtle until she understood its implications. With that knowledge came the possibility of control. Cale stood before her one afternoon, approximately 2 weeks into the training, and simply allowed her to look at him directly, not in confrontation, but in observation, as though they were conducting an experiment in the nature of her immunity. "Try," he said simply. She reached for the power, felt it surge toward her eyes with eager intensity, and pushed it forward. The golden light emerged from her gaze with force that made her catch her breath. And nothing happened. Cale remained standing, his gray eyes steady on hers, unaffected and unmoved. But she felt something different this time. Not a wall of immunity, but rather a sensation of touching something so ancient and vast that her power simply could not find purchase against it. "Your power recognizes hierarchy," Cale explained, moving toward her without any indication that the exercise had been anything but clinical. "On some level deeper than consciousness, it understands that I exist in a different category of being than other shifters. It refuses to dominate what it recognizes as an authority structure that supersedes your own." He paused, letting the chamber's hum settle. "But immunity is a matter of state, not nature. Choice, intimacy, or a moment of lowered guard can invite the force you wield past ancient wards. What resists you at a distance may yield if I consent, or if emotion cracks the armor I wear. That's not comforting," Iris said quietly. "It's not intended to be," Cale replied. "It's intended to be instructive." The third week brought a change in the nature of their work together. Cale stopped bringing objects for her to practice with, and instead asked her to explain what she felt when she accessed her power, to describe the sensation of it moving through her body, to articulate the emotional state that accompanied its emergence. "It's terrifying," she admitted one afternoon as they sat on the chamber floor, the luminescent stones providing the only light. "Even now, after all this training, when I feel it building, all I can think is that I'm going to destroy something." "Someone. What would you destroy if you could?" Cale asked. And there was nothing cruel in the question, only genuine curiosity. "The fear," Iris said. "If I could destroy anything, I would destroy the fear. It's been there longer than anything else. Abbott put it there. My parents reinforced it, and I've been adding to it for nearly a decade. It's the only thing I actually have control over, and I've used that control to lock myself into a prison." Kyle was silent for a long moment. Then he reached toward her, his hand open, and she understood what he was offering. Permission. A space to practice what she had been learning, but with a human, rather than an object. With someone whose presence could offer feedback that stone could not. She reached for the power cautiously, felt it respond with that now familiar surge. The golden light emerged from her eyes, and for the first time, instead of immediately withdrawing it, she allowed it to remain. She felt Cale's consciousness on the periphery of her power's reach, felt how the ancient parts of his being simply could not be dominated, and realized that this was safe. This was actually safe. But then something shifted. She felt herself being overwhelmed by emotion. Months of isolation, years of repression, the weight of everything she had been forced to become simply cascading through her system in a moment of pure vulnerability. The power that had been modulated and controlled suddenly shattered those boundaries and surged outward with all the force of a breaking dam. Cale's body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, and she saw the moment his consciousness simply ceased to exist as an independent force. The golden light from her eyes poured into him, subsumed his will, and she felt his entire being surrender to her dominance. Terror seized her. She tried to withdraw the power, but it had taken on a momentum of its own, and she could only watch as Cale knelt before her, his body curved in absolute submission, his will simply no longer his own. Then he spoke. His voice was strange, distorted by the compulsion that gripped him, but the words came with absolute clarity. "I choose this," he said, and she heard in his voice something that transcended the forced submission. "I choose you. I choose to let you have this power over me because I trust you with it, because I love you." The admission shattered something in Iris's chest. The power that had been roaring through her like a fire suddenly contracted, pulled back inward, retreated entirely. Cale collapsed, gasping for breath, and she found herself on her knees beside him, shaking with sobs that seemed to come from depths of her being she hadn't known existed. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I know," Cale said, his voice hoarse. "That's how I know you're safe. You didn't mean to, and the moment you realized what was happening, you released me. You could have held on. You could have kept me in that state indefinitely. And you didn't." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. For the first time since her power had awakened and fractured her entire world into before and after, she did not feel like a weapon. She felt like a person who was feared and hunted and fundamentally dangerous, but a person nonetheless. They remained in the chamber, as the light from the stones shifted and changed, as hours seemed to pass, or perhaps merely minutes. Time moved strangely here, and neither of them was paying particularly close attention to its passage. And when they finally emerged into the corridors of the fortress, something fundamental had changed between them. Jackson was waiting near the entrance to the ritual chamber. His expression, when he took in the disarray of their appearance, the way Cale moved with a certain exhaustion that suggested something far more intense than simple magical practice, was carefully neutral. But when he spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested he understood far more than either of them had wanted him to witness. "The Alpha King should be careful about what connections he forges," Jackson said quietly, "especially with creatures whose nature is to dominate. Eventually, someone will ask why he's willing to risk so much for something that by law should not exist." Iris felt Cale tense beside her, felt the sudden shift in the atmosphere that suggested violence might emerge at any moment. But instead, Cale simply moved past his beta, his hand still connected to hers. "They can ask whatever they wish," Cale said, and there was something in his voice that suggested finality. "The answer will not change." When she finally returned to her tower chamber that evening, Iris found herself unable to sleep, unable to do anything but stand at the window and look out at the landscape that existed between worlds. She thought about what Cale had said while trapped in the compulsion of her gaze, about the choice he had made even while his will was not technically his own, and she wondered what happened next. In a world where she had just given the Alpha King the ability to claim that she had dominated him, and he had responded by declaring that to the very people who would use that information as evidence of her danger. The consequences were coming. She could feel them in the way the fortress had shifted, in the tension that now seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of everything. But for the first time since Abbott had raised her in isolation, she was not facing that future alone. Chapter 5. The Web Unravels. The casual mention came during an afternoon when Cale was reviewing territorial reports in the tower chamber where Iris had taken to spending her time. She was reading through one of the ancient texts he had provided, her fingers tracing the edges of faded parchment, when she suddenly looked up and spoke without preamble. "Abbot used to perform rituals when I was younger," she said quietly. "Strange ceremonies at odd hours. He would bring people to the temple, shifters mostly, though sometimes humans who seemed to be there against their will. He always said it was necessary training for me, that exposure to various magical traditions would broaden my understanding." Kyle set down his documents immediately. "What kind of rituals?" "I was never allowed to witness them directly," Iris continued, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall details she had spent years trying to suppress. "But I could hear chanting through the stone walls. And afterward, he would always seem satisfied, like something had been accomplished." The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Kale's network of spies and informants reached into corners of the shifter kingdoms that Iris had not known existed. Within 7 days, the full architecture of conspiracy had been laid bare. Abbot Greystone was not merely a rogue tutor, but a senior operative of an organization called the Archives, a group that had existed for over 20 years with singular purpose: to locate, study, and eventually weaponize magical artifacts and individuals that conventional shifter society considered dangerous or aberrant. The death of Iris's parents had not been accidental. It had been orchestrated specifically to traumatize her into activating her power prematurely, to ensure that when she finally manifested, she would do so in a state of psychological vulnerability that made her easier to control. But there was more. The Archives was not a localized threat. It was a network that extended across multiple kingdoms, multiple continents. And there were others like Iris, other Omegas carrying fragments of ancient magic, scattered across the realm, hunted with the same methodical patience that had been applied to her. Kale shared this information with Iris in fragments, each revelation arriving like a piece of a larger nightmare, slowly assembling itself into coherence. But what shook her most profoundly was the discovery of Jackson's involvement. The Beta had been conspiring for 3 years. 3 years of careful cultivation of relationships with certain nobles who chafed under Kale's authority. 3 years of building alliances with shifters from rival packs who viewed the Alpha King's power as an impediment to their own ambitions. And Jackson had not been working alone. "My mother," Kale said, and there was something in his voice that suggested the words tasted like ash. "She contacted him after Abbott arrived at the fortress. She made an agreement. Help eliminate you. And in exchange, she would support his ascension to Alpha once I was sufficiently destabilized." Iris felt something cold settle in her stomach. "She wants to kill me. She wants to protect what she perceives as the natural order," Kale corrected, though the distinction felt hollow. "But the effect is the same. The attack came on the 8th day of the investigation. It came with the violence of something that had been carefully planned for months, coordinated across multiple factions, timed to coincide with a moment when Kale's attention would be fractured across dealing with the conspiracy's revelation. The assault began at dawn. Mercenary shifters infiltrated the fortress through passages that should have been sealed, passages that could only have been revealed by someone who had lived within these walls for decades. Magical attacks struck simultaneously at multiple points: the defensive wards that protected the castle, the garrison barracks where Kale's most loyal soldiers trained, the throne room itself where documents related to his authority were stored. It was a coordinated destruction designed to create maximum chaos in minimum time. Iris heard the initial explosions from her tower chamber and immediately understood that something fundamental had shifted. She tried to reach Kale through the mental connection that had begun developing between them during their training sessions, felt his consciousness stretched thin across 100 different crises. Then she felt something else, someone else, seizing her from behind with inhuman strength. Jackson. The Beta had found her, and his eyes held the glint of something that went beyond mere ambition. He lifted her bodily and began moving toward a section of the tower that should not have existed, a passage that opened onto a chamber where something that was not quite a door hung in the air, shimmering with unstable magical energy. "I'm saving you," Jackson said, his voice somehow carrying sincerity despite the violence of his actions. "Whatever he promised you, whatever fantasy he sold you about being safe here, it ends now. Come with me, and I can keep you alive." Iris struggled, felt her power surge toward her eyes in response to the threat. and realized with horror that she could not access it. Something was dampening her ability to call upon the ancient magic, something woven into the very stone of the fortress that had been designed specifically to suppress her in moments of duress. Then Kyle appeared in the doorway, and his presence seemed to fill the space with a different kind of power entirely. He was bleeding from a wound along his ribs, his breathing heavy, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he had already killed today and would not hesitate to do it again. The confrontation between Kale and Jackson lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The beta was skilled, fast, dangerous, but he was not the Alpha King. Jackson was thrown backward through the portal he had created, tumbling into that shimmering space between realities with a sound like breaking glass. The passage collapsed behind him, sealing itself, and there was a finality to the gesture that suggested Jackson would not be returning to this realm in the foreseeable future. But the victory was incomplete. Morvana emerged from the shadows of the tower, and she was not coming to stop the attack. She was coming to finish what she had started. "You should have killed her when you had the chance," Morvana said, and her voice carried the weight of centuries of authority. "Instead, you've made yourself into a liability, and liabilities must be addressed." The magic she unleashed was ancient and terrible. Kyle met her with his own power, but Iris could see immediately that this was not a fight he was going to win through strength alone. Morvana was his mother, and despite everything, there were connections between them that prevented him from fighting with absolute ferocity. There were hesitations, microseconds where his power did not flow with complete commitment, and those microseconds were enough for Morvana's assault to find their mark. Kale was bleeding from multiple wounds, his movements becoming sluggish, and Iris suddenly understood that Morvana was not just attacking him with magic, but with a curse, something layered and complex that was draining his vitality even as it inflicted physical damage. That was when Abbott appeared. The older man moved through the chaos of the fortress with almost casual indifference, stepping over fallen guards and burned stone as though they were merely obstacles in a familiar path. His eyes, when they found Iris, held the satisfaction of someone who was finally claiming something that had long been promised to him. "Your power," he said, approaching her with measured steps, "has been the objective of the archives for decades. We have been patient. We have been methodical. And now, finally, we will have what we came for." He reached out and touched her forehead with one finger, and Iris felt something sear through her consciousness like a brand being applied to her soul. It was a marking. She understood immediately, something that would slowly drain her life force. Something that would leave her weakened and vulnerable, and ultimately useless to anyone but him. Kyle, seeing what was happening, pushed through his exhaustion and his wound, and the crushing weight of the curse that Morvana had placed upon him. He threw himself between Abbott and Iris, taking the full force of the marking intended for her. The symbol burned into his chest, and Iris watched in horror as his breathing became labored, as the color drained from his face, as the ancient curse began its slow work of consuming him from the inside out. Morvana, seeing her son fall, seemed to recognize finally what she had done. She paused in her assault, her expression shifting from fury to something more complex, something that might have been regret, or might have been too late for such emotions. She turned and fled deeper into the fortress, leaving the battle to its conclusion. Abbott, satisfied with his work, vanished into the shadows, and moments later, Iris felt the presence of Jackson disappearing entirely from the realm, his essence severed from this world through the portal that had collapsed behind him. And there, in the chaos of the fortress, Iris knelt beside Kale and felt the slow, relentless drain of the curse that was killing them both. Chapter 6. The Cost of Salvation. The mountain pass that led to Iron Peak's hidden entrances was not marked on any map that existed in the human world. Mira had followed the faint traces of magical disturbance through the landscape for weeks, using techniques her mother had taught her in whispered lessons late at night, back when her mother was still alive and still willing to speak of things that conventional shifter society preferred to ignore. The rituals were crude by comparison to what the shifters could accomplish, but they had the advantage of being rooted in human persistence rather than innate supernatural power. Step by step, prayer by prayer, Mira had traced the path that Iris had been forced to travel. She carried with her a bundle of materials prepared with meticulous care. herbs gathered at specific times of the lunar cycle, water drawn from springs that existed in spaces between seasons. Words written in her mother's careful hand, copied and recopied, until Mira had memorized every syllable, every inflection of the ancient language that belonged to humanity, before it had learned to divide itself into those with power and those without. The fortress itself was in chaos when she finally breached its outer defenses. The magical wards that should have prevented her entry were flickering, destabilized by the assault that was occurring within. Bodies lay scattered across courtyards, shifters in various states of transformation, some killed cleanly, others bearing evidence of having been caught in magical crossfire. The smell of burned stone and spilled blood hung in the air like a veil. Mira moved through the devastation with the careful precision of someone who understood that hesitation would get her killed. She did not have shifter strength or supernatural awareness, but she had something else. An absolute certainty about where she needed to go. The connection between her and Iris had been forged when she placed her mother's amulet into Iris's hand in that desperate moment after the beta had been dominated. That connection sang through her now like a tuning fork struck to its precise frequency. She found Cale in a chamber buried deep within the fortress's lower levels. He was conscious, but barely, his breathing shallow and his skin taking on the gray pallor of someone whose life force was being actively drained from his body. The mark on his chest glowed with a sickly luminescence, and she could see the way the curse was consuming him from the inside out, spreading through his veins like ink through water. "Where is she?" Mira asked, kneeling beside him without hesitation. "The ritual chamber," Cale managed, his voice little more than a rasp. "Beneath. Abbott has her. He's trying to drain her power to break the ancient seals." "How long?" Mira asked, already opening the bundle of materials she had prepared. "Minutes," Cale said. "Maybe less." Mira began the ritual without allowing herself time for doubt. The components were arranged in precise patterns on the stone floor, herbs forming sigils, water creating channels of connection, and at the center, a silver knife that had belonged to her mother, forged in human bloodlines stretching back generations. She spoke the words in the old language, feeling them shape reality around her as she did, feeling the way ancient magic responded to invocation even from human lips. The curse resisted. It had been designed to anchor itself in shifter physiology, to feed on the supernatural nature of its host. Being transferred to a human body was an aberration, and the magic thrashed against the conduit Mira had created. She felt it trying to claw its way back toward Cale, but she held the ritual steady, held it firm, refused to let her concentration waver, despite the pain that was beginning to bloom throughout her own form. The mark that appeared on her own chest was smaller than the one on Cale's had been, but she could feel its presence immediately. The drain was different in a human body, less localized, more dispersed. Instead of gathering in a single point and burning through her vitality like a star collapsing in upon itself, the curse spread throughout her entire system, a slow seeping of life force that would take years to fully consume her, rather than days. Cale gasped as the immediate pressure was lifted from his chest. Color began to return to his face as his body's natural healing abilities reasserted themselves. He tried to sit up, and Mira helped him, though the effort made her aware of how the curse was already beginning its work. "You've condemned yourself," Kyle said, understanding immediately what she had done. "I've bought time," Mira corrected. "Now go. Save her. That's what matters." Kyle moved, and even though he was still weakened by the curse's lingering effects and the wounds he had sustained during the battle, his speed was inhuman. Mira watched him vanish into the depths of the fortress, and then sat down heavily, placing her hand over the mark on her chest, feeling the slow, patient drain of a curse that would define the remaining years of her human life. The ritual chamber existed in a state of semi-collapse when Cale reached it. The magical defenses that had been assembled were destabilizing, their architecture cracking as though something fundamental was being challenged from within. Abbott Greystone stood in the center of the chamber, his body surrounded by channels of flowing light that connected him to Iris, who hung suspended in the air, her eyes blazing with golden radiance so intense that it seemed to burn away the normal spectrum of visible light. The Archive's senior operative was channeling through her, using her power as a conduit to assault the ancient seals that had been set in place millennia ago. The magic was devastating, architectural in its complexity, and it was working. Iris could see the seals beginning to fracture, beginning to fail under the weight of the assault being directed through her own consciousness. Cale attacked Abbott without hesitation, but the older man was shielded by magic that would have protected him from most threats. The attack failed to connect, and Abbott laughed, a sound of triumph that echoed through the chamber. "Your king arrives too late," Abbott said. "The seals are breaking. The old magic will flow free, and the archives will be there to harness it. Everything we have worked toward comes to fruition." That was when Iris made a choice that changed everything. She had been learning to control her power through all the weeks of training with Cale, understanding how to direct it, how to modulate it, how to make it serve her will rather than simply express her terror. She had been passive in her own domination, allowing her gaze to overwhelm others, but never truly asserting conscious direction over the force of her nature. Now she seized control. She turned that concentrated force not against Abbott, but against the magic itself. Her eyes locked onto the flows of power that were channeling through her, and she dominated them the way she had learned to dominate shifter consciousness. The ancient magic, in its essence, recognized hierarchy. It recognized that the being channeling it was fundamentally weaker than the power she wielded, and when confronted with absolute dominance expressed through eyes that carried the weight of authority, it did what magic had always done when faced with indisputable hierarchy. It submitted. The seals did not break. Instead, they refortified themselves, recognizing in Iris something they had not encountered in millennia, a consciousness that carried the mark of the old hierarchy, a being whose authority superseded that of those who would exploit ancient magic for gain. The backlash of power returned through the channels Abbott had established, and it did so with devastating force. Abbott's scream was brief. His form simply could not withstand the magnitude of energy that flooded through his consciousness. He was consumed by the magic he had attempted to harness, destroyed absolutely, not even leaving a body in the aftermath. He was simply gone. Iris collapsed, and Cale caught her before she struck the stone floor. She was unconscious, her breath shallow but present, and for a long moment, the Alpha King simply held her, feeling through the bond they had forged that she was alive, that she was safe, that everything they had fought for had not been in vain. Then he lifted her and began the journey back to the surface, back to the world where they would have to face the consequences of everything that had just transpired. Chapter 7. The Ritual of Becoming. 3 days passed before Iris's eyes opened. 3 days of dreamless sleep, of her body working to repair itself after the catastrophic drain that Abbott had attempted to impose upon her. When consciousness finally returned, it came slowly, like surfacing through layers of increasingly thinner ice. She became aware first of sensation, the softness of sheets beneath her, the warmth of natural sunlight streaming through windows, the sound of breathing that was not her own. Cale sat in a chair beside her bed, watching. He had been there for most of those 3 days, his presence a constant anchor, his consciousness brushing gently against hers through the bond that had begun forming between them during their training sessions. He did not speak as her eyes opened, simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that language could come later. "How long?" Iris asked, her voice rough from disuse. 3 days, Cale confirmed. "You pushed yourself beyond safe limits when you seized control of the seals. Your body needed time to recover." Iris moved slowly, testing each muscle, and found that she was stronger than before. The repression that had defined her entire existence was gone. Her power no longer pressed against her consciousness, like something trying to escape a cage. It flowed through her, integrated and present, responding to her will rather than overwhelming it. "Morvana," she said, sitting up more fully. "What happened to—" "She's here," Cale said quietly. "She wants to speak with you. And Iris, you should know that she's willing to listen." The confrontation happened in one of the fortress's smaller chambers, a room designed for intimate conversations rather than political declarations. Morvana was waiting when Iris arrived, and the first thing Iris noticed was that the woman looked diminished somehow, as though 3 days of reflection had stripped away some of the armor she had worn for so long. "I tried to kill you," Morvana said without preamble. "I tried to kill my own son. And why? Because I was afraid. Because I couldn't accept that the world had changed in ways I was not prepared to understand." Iris said nothing, simply waited. "Your grandmother," Morvana continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory, "manipulated me when I was young. She used her eyes the way you use yours, and she bent my will to hers. She took something from me, not just physically but spiritually, a part of myself that I could never fully recover. For decades, I told myself that if I could prevent another creature with that power from existing, I could somehow erase what happened to me. I'm not my grandmother," Iris said quietly. "No," Morvana agreed. "You're not. I can see that now. I can see that you're afraid of your own power in ways she never was. I can see that you've spent your entire life trying not to become what everyone assumed you would be." Morvana reached out, and Iris found herself accepting the older woman's touch. It was not an embrace, not quite reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of understanding that trauma could be passed down through generations, and that breaking those cycles required more courage than simply continuing them. "I will accept this," Morvana said. "I will accept you and my son's choice, but understand that I do so imperfectly. The wounds your grandmother carved into my soul are still present. They will not heal in my lifetime, but I can choose not to perpetuate them." After Morvana left, Mira appeared in the doorway, with the careful timing of someone who had been waiting just outside. She embraced Iris with the fierce protectiveness of a friend who had sacrificed more than most would have been willing to give. "The curse," Iris said, feeling through their connection the slow drain that was beginning to define Mira's existence. "I'll live," Mira said. 10 years, maybe a little more. That's longer than I expected to have. That's enough." She left Iris and Kale alone then, understanding intuitively that some conversations required privacy. Kale took Iris's hand and led her deeper into the fortress, down corridors that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously, toward the ancestral ritual chamber, where they had spent those intense weeks of training. But where before the chamber had been a space for learning and practice, now it had been transformed. Candles burned in precise patterns, their flames creating illumination that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. Symbols had been drawn on the stone floor in materials that glowed with their own inner light, and the air itself seemed to hum with accumulated power. "This is the ritual of bonding," Kale explained. "It is permanent. It is eternal. It exists not just in this life, but across the boundaries of whatever comes after." "Are you certain?" Iris looked at him, at the man who had seen her at her absolute worst and had chosen to see her power not as a curse, but as something beautiful. She thought about all the years of isolation, all the fear, all the careful construction of walls designed to protect others from her, and she thought about what it felt like to have someone look at her and see not danger, but possibility. "Yes," she said. The ritual itself was not performed in words, but in connection. They stood facing each other, and slowly, carefully, they allowed their consciousness to merge. It was more intimate than any physical touch could have been, more vulnerable than standing naked before another person. Iris felt Kale's entire history opening before her. Centuries of power, of isolation, of learning to carry the weight of command without letting it crush him. And Kale felt Iris's fear, her desperation, her incredible strength in surviving circumstances that should have destroyed her. Their powers met in that joining, not as opposing forces, but as complementary elements. Iris's dominance and Kale's authority, her ancient magic and his refined control, her willingness to be vulnerable and his capacity to hold that vulnerability with absolute care. When the ritual concluded, they found themselves on their knees before each other, tears streaming down both their faces, connected in ways that transcended simple emotion or attraction. They were bonded at the fundamental level, their very essences intertwined in a pattern that could not be unraveled without destroying both of them. Kale helped Iris to her feet, and then he stepped back slightly, creating space. "Now," he said softly, "you can transform." Iris had been terrified of this moment for so long that the reality of it was almost anticlimactic. She reached for the wolf that lived inside her, the part of herself that she had denied and repressed and feared, and found that it came willingly. There was no explosion of pain, no violent wrenching of her form. Instead, there was a sense of homecoming, of a fundamental part of herself finally being allowed to exist. Her form rippled and changed, and suddenly she was standing on 4 legs, her body covered in white fur, with hints of silver that seemed to catch the light. She looked down at her transformed hands, now paws, and felt the world expand around her. Colors had shifted, sounds had become crystalline in their clarity, and everywhere her consciousness could sense the presence of Kale, still in his human form, watching with absolute wonder. "Beautiful," he whispered, reaching out to touch her transformed form. The transformation released something in Iris that had been locked away since childhood. It was freedom in its truest form, freedom from the fear that had defined her, freedom from the repression that had been slowly killing her from the inside out. She circled Kale in her wolf form, feeling the joy of movement without fear, of power without guilt. When she transformed back to human form, hours later, she found that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself. She was no longer a curse, no longer an aberration, no longer something that needed to be hidden or controlled or apologized for. She was simply Iris, with all that entailed, dangerous and powerful and beautiful and complex. Chapter 8. Where Worlds Converge. 6 months transformed the landscape of Iron Peak in ways that extended far beyond simple architectural repair. The fortress, which had been a symbol of power and isolation for centuries, had become something different. A place where the boundaries between what was considered possible and what had previously been deemed impossible had been deliberately, irrevocably erased. The training chamber that Iris had established occupied one of the towers that had sustained minimal damage during the assault. She worked there with 3 young Omegas who had been discovered through careful investigations conducted by Kale's network of informants. Each of them carried fragments of ancient power. Each had been hidden away or hunted or feared for most of their lives, and each came to her with the same fundamental desperation, the need to understand what they were before it destroyed them. She taught them what Kale had taught her, that power was not inherently dangerous, but ignorance of power certainly was. She taught them to modulate their abilities, to understand the architecture of their own nature, to move through the world without apologizing for their existence. One of them, a young woman named Sarah who carried power in her voice, whatever she spoke became binding truth to those who heard her, came to Iris at the end of one training session with tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was broken," Sarah said. "My mother told me I was cursed. My family locked me away. And now I'm understanding that what I am is just different. Not broken. Not wrong. No," Iris confirmed. "Just different. And different can be beautiful." Mira moved through the fortress with the careful precision of someone whose body was slowly betraying her. The curse that she had absorbed from Kale continued its patient work, draining her life force with inexorable slowness. But instead of allowing that drain to define her, Mira had chosen to transform it. She spent her days documenting the rituals her mother had taught her, writing them down in careful detail, preserving human magic in text that future generations could access. She had become, in essence, a living bridge between the human world and the supernatural one. She and Iris maintained the kind of friendship that required no words, only presence. They would sit together sometimes in the library, Mira working on her documentation, while Iris read through texts about the history of her power, and the comfortable silence between them spoke of a bond forged through crisis and strengthened by mutual sacrifice. Morvana had requested a small chamber in the fortress's eastern wing, a retreat where she could exist with some degree of separation from the daily operations of the kingdom. She did not attend court functions, did not insert herself into political decisions, but neither was she exiled entirely. It was, Iris had come to understand, the best that could be offered to a woman who had nearly destroyed everything, and who was slowly learning to live with the consequences of that attempt. The Guardians made contact on a morning in early spring, when the ice that had locked the mountainous terrain all winter was finally beginning to break apart. A messenger arrived, bearing the sigil of an organization that had worked in the shadows for generations, an order dedicated to protecting those who carried ancient power, who fought against the archives, and similar groups that sought to weaponize the magical fragments that existed scattered across the realms. The message was brought directly to Cale and Iris in the chamber they had made their own, a space that existed between the public areas of the fortress and the purely private ones. A room where they could exist as neither purely rulers nor purely lovers, but simply as themselves. "The seals are failing," the messenger said, and she was a woman of indeterminate age, with eyes that held the particular clarity of someone who had spent their life in service to something larger than themselves. Not all at once, but progressively. One in the northern territories is showing signs of collapse, another in the eastern kingdoms. The archives is accelerating their efforts. There are other Omegas with power similar to yours scattered across the world. Some we have found and protected. Others remain hidden, vulnerable, hunted. Kyle and Iris exchanged a glance that carried entire conversations. They both understood what this meant. The fight that had seemed to conclude at Iron Peak was only a beginning. There were other realms, other kingdoms, other women and men with ancient power running through their veins, all of them in danger. "We'll help," Iris said without hesitation. "Tell us what you need." After the messenger left, Cale pulled Iris close, his arms wrapping around her from behind as they stood at the window of their chamber, looking out at landscape that existed simultaneously in multiple realities. "This is not going to be simple," he said. "No," Iris agreed. "But nothing has been simple since that day in the village." He turned her to face him, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was committing this moment to memory. After 6 months of bonding, of building a relationship that transcended the simple physical or emotional, there were still moments when he looked at her with an intensity that suggested he was amazed she existed, that she had chosen him, that they had somehow managed to navigate all the chaos and come out on the other side together. "I love you," he said, and the words were simple and perfect, and exactly what she needed to hear. "I know," Iris replied, smiling at the echo of an old pattern they had established months ago. "I love you too." That night, in the chamber they had claimed as their own, Iris transformed into her wolf form, and Cale followed, his body shifting into the massive wolf that he carried within himself. They moved through the corridors of the fortress together, two beings of power moving through darkness that they could navigate better than any human ever could. They descended to the lower chambers, to the space where the ancient seals glowed with quiet intensity, and they felt through their bond the way those seals recognized them both, acknowledged them as entities worthy of their protection. The future was uncertain. The archives had not been destroyed, merely scattered. Abbott was dead, but the organization he had served remained active, motivated, searching. Jackson remained somewhere in the spaces between worlds, and while Iris did not think he represented an immediate threat, she also did not believe that his exile was permanent. Threats would come. Challenges would emerge. Other Omegas would need help. Other seals would need reinforcement. And Iris's life would never be the simple hidden thing she had once dreamed of. But as she stood in her human form beside Cale, feeling through the bond the absolute certainty of his presence, understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together, she realized that she had never actually wanted simplicity. She had wanted freedom. She had wanted to be herself without apology. She had wanted to transform her power from curse into gift. And she had found all of that, in the most unlikely of places, with the most unlikely of companions. The fortress of Iron Peak stood as it had for centuries, ancient and enduring, its stones soaked in the blood and tears and triumphs of generations of shifters. But within its walls now existed something that had been absent before, a space where those who had been deemed aberrations could find refuge, where ancient power could be studied and understood rather than feared, where the impossible had become not just possible but inevitable. And at the heart of that transformation stood Iris Caldwell, who had begun as a girl in hiding and had become a queen, not through conquest, not through domination of her power, but through the simple, revolutionary act of accepting what she was and refusing to apologize for it. The journey was only beginning, but for the first time in her life, Iris was ready for what came next, because she was no longer walking that journey alone. The end.